Hello and welcome to the Reviews Brothers. Horror movies are great, featuring some terrifying monsters and sexy women usually. What's not to love? And of course they lend themselves perfectly to video games, giving you the chance to see if you can survive against an unbeatable monster. So yeah, that's what we're doing today, taking a look at some games based on scary movies. As we know, horror movies are never crap, and licensed games are always great, so surely it's a match made in heaven. Let's find out, shall we? As I shut up, you press that subscribe button, and we take a look at some games. We are going to start on the Atari 2600 with an adaptation of one of the best horror movies of all time, Halloween. Of course, the movie is about Laurie Strode, played by the one and only Jamie Lee Curtis, who is a babysitter that is stalked by a serial mentalist, Michael Myers, who sadly for her has a thing for chopping up babysitters. So in the game you play as Laurie, and you have to survive as long as you possibly can while protecting the children of the house that you're in, while avoiding Michael as best you can. Now, as it's an Atari game, there really isn't a whole lot to everything here. It's a very simple game. You move around the house, which has a load of rooms. Every now and then you'll find a child running around scared, so what you have to do is hold down the action button as you walk past them, and they'll start to follow you. Then you need to guide them as far to the left or right as you possibly can, and you'll eventually find a safe room that Michael never enters. You'll know when you're there, as the kid will stop following you and you'll get some points and a funky noise. But of course Michael will pop up randomly, swinging his knife. When you see him, you just have to run in the opposite direction, otherwise he'll kill either you or the kid. Now thankfully there are unlimited kids in this house, don't know what these parents are like, so it doesn't matter how many of them die really, but if he stabs you, you will die. And in fact, he doesn't just stab you, he cuts your whole damn head off, which is pretty sweet. And there's even some gore here, with blood spurting out when you die. You can also find a knife that you can use against Michael, but you can only use it once you've found it, then you have to find another one. Hitting him with it makes him run away, which is nice and gives you a bit of a breather. Of course, it's all about the high score here, and you just play until you lose all your lives or you get bored, which is probably more likely to happen first if I'm honest. Now that's not to say that it's a bad game though, it's just that once you've played it for 5 minutes, you've seen everything it has to offer, which again is kind of an Atari thing. The controls here are fine and actually quite good. Getting the kids to safety is easy, though they do sometimes stop following you, and I could never tell if that was deliberate because they're dumb kids, or just because the game is an Atari one. Also, what's cool is that some rooms have a strobe effect where all the lights will go out and flicker on and off, so you don't know where Michael's going to pop up, making it harder to avoid him. Also, the music here is a great rendition of the classic theme song, which sounds pretty cool. But that's all there is to it. The game looks decent enough, and it's good for a few minutes, but won't exactly blow you away. But if you like the movie and only have an Atari, this is fine. That wasn't the only classic horror to get a game on the Atari though, as the Texas Chainsaw Massacre also got a game on the system. And by the way, apparently both of these games did cause a bit of outrage for their violence back in the day. Isn't that cute? Anyway, this is of course based on the movie where a crazy cannibal family, one of which has a fetish for chainsaws, capture and murder a bunch of kids on a road trip. And amazingly, the game here actually lets you play as the bad guy. In this case it's the legendary Leatherface, a guy who wears a mask made of the skin of the people he's killed and eaten. So you play as him and you head out onto your farm and have to hunt down as many defenseless women as you can and chop them into bits with your chainsaw. Again, as this is an Atari game, there's no real end game. You just basically have a timer in the form of the fuel for your chainsaw, and you have to walk left or right until you see a woman who will then let out a fucking annoying high-pitched scream, and then chase them down, hit your button and chop them to bits. Repeat this 20 times and you're done. There are obstacles you'll need to avoid, like fences, skulls and wheelchairs, which are all a nod to other characters and scenes from the movie. If you so much as touch a pixel of one of these, you can't move for a few seconds, wasting valuable fuel, aka time. The more people you kill, the faster everything moves, making it harder to avoid these obstacles that come at you from off-screen at a blistering pace. Also, when you catch up to a girl, they'll do some sweet parkour to avoid you, and you'll need to have fast reactions so they don't get away. If you take too long, then you'll get kicked up the arse and it's game over and you'd have to try again. It's a fine game, but nothing you'll play for more than a few minutes at a time, which really is something that applies to pretty much all Atari games if you ask me. I'm not a huge fan. It looks alright though. The limited colours make it look like you are carrying a massive tap rather than a devastating chainsaw, and there isn't any gore here, which is a bit of a surprise considering the source material. Though to be fair, the game isn't actually that crazy gory. Most of it is just left to your imagination, which often makes it worse. As for the game though, yeah, give it a go as a curiosity, but you won't find yourself spending loads of time with it. Bram Stoker's Dracula is a great vampire movie with a stellar performance from Gary Oldman as the titular vampire bastard, and of course Keanu Reeves doing one of the most questionable English accents in any film ever. It's a fantastic film with a ton of atmosphere and spooky goings on. That, to be honest, isn't really the kind of film you'd expect to be made into a game, but that won't stop them. There's actually quite a few versions of the game, and here is the Sega CD one, because it's just so damn amazing. You play as Jonathan Harker, Keanu Reeves' character, and you have to infiltrate Dracula's castle and take the bastard down. As you can see, it's all done with amazing digitised graphics, and it's a joy to look at. Well, about as much of a joy as it is to play, which isn't very much at all. And yes, that's meant to be Keanu Reeves' character. It's an action beat-em-up where you side-scroll to the right on some very dodgy pre-rendered backgrounds. On the way, you're attacked by all manner of beasts, mostly bats, rats, birds, and the occasional skeleton, zombie and demon. You know, just like in the movie. Each level is fairly long and also pretty packed with bad guys, but don't worry, you've got some totally useless attacks to help you out. You can punch, kick and jump here. By pressing different directions on the D-pad when you attack, you do different attacks, and you'll need to learn which is the best to use depending on where enemies are and what they are, because you need to do a certain attack against most of them. Most of the enemies here seem to be flying ones, and for some reason they all seem to fly in Gallagher-style formations. The problem there being that you often don't have time for your animations to play out in order to defeat them all without taking any damage first. So yeah, this means you'll be taking a lot of damage. Thankfully, you can take a fair bit of punishment before you die, and you will occasionally find health and even extra lives somewhere in the levels. But the control in general is just really bad here. It's sluggish and unresponsive, there's no jump attack, instead you have to press up and kick to attack anything that's above you. It just doesn't feel natural in a game that lets you actually jump. And the jump itself is unreliable at best. You've got no control once you've left the ground, and there's often pit deaths that are hard to avoid. Also, because collision detection is just terrible, you'll likely fall through the floor rather than land on a platform most of the time. Between levels you do get clips from the movie, but these are incredibly low quality and it's so dark that it's almost impossible to see what's happening, though I could admit that this could be an emulator thing, but why you'd pay for the real game, I don't know. The graphics, even though they're digitised, are terrible. They look worse than Mortal Kombat 1 despite coming out after that game. The animations are bad, the pre-rendered backgrounds and enemies are incredibly grainy, and for some reason your character seems to be in black and white. Now, I will say that this is one of those games where I would actually recommend playing it, because it's just so damn bad that if you have a night with it and a couple of mates, you will definitely get a laugh out of it. I do not recommend paying for this game, but maybe see if you can find another way to play it. Not to be outdone, Mary Shelley demanded that her monster, Frankenstein, and yes I know that's not the monster's name, got his own game based on the movie. And boy, this really is a pile of crap. The movie is all about the monster and how it's all misunderstood and that. People think that he's an evil killing machine, but much like anyone in their 30s, he just wants to be left alone. The book and movie are both pretty good, though the movie can be a bit of a slog to get through, but that's nothing compared to the game. It's a side-scrolling action game, and to be fair, it doesn't start off too bad. The intro is really cool, with a decent opening cinematic with Frankie being brought to life, but then you start the game and it's one of those where the hell do I go kind of ones. Frankie limps around the levels armed with a pointed stick. You can use this to whack people in the face, which for some reason makes them explode into a plume of smoke, though it's easier said than done, as the reach on this is much shorter than you'd think, and pretty much every enemy in the game has a longer reach than you, making it almost impossible to kill anyone without taking damage first. If you find a flame on your journeys, you can light your stick on fire, which makes it do more damage, but it's still useless. In various levels you'll find doorways and windows that can be broken. This is to stop people from popping out and throwing shit at you. There's also doorways everywhere that you can go through, and these all lead to random places, making the levels a pain in the ass to navigate. Even the first level is needlessly convoluted, and I'm sure most people would give up before they see the end of it. I almost did, but I did persevere and managed to get to the second level, which saw me in a dark crypt-like place which was very dark and you needed to push blocks all over the place, and it was incredibly tedious. I really had to force myself to play for more than 30 minutes. And I wish that I did stop playing because I really did not enjoy any of my time with this game. Now, the graphics and animation aren't bad at all, so you have to give it its dues there, but the controls are terrible. They're laggy, slow, unresponsive, and jumping on ledges is a chore. Even pulling switches and hitting enemies is awkward and never works the way you want it to. Also, most platforms have you bang your head on them if you jump from underneath, which does happen in a lot of games, but just the way that all the levels and platforms are laid out here makes it really hard to do just basic platforming. I can't stress enough how much of a dick this game is to play. It really is one of the worst I've played on the Super Nintendo. Unlike Dracula, this game is not so good it's bad, it's just bad. Don't play it unless you're an idiot. Here is Ju-On, the Grudge Haunted House Simulator for the Wii. Now, you know what? This game gets a lot of bad press all over the holy internet, but I actually quite like it. I've never actually seen any of the Grudge movies, I don't think, but I'm a big fan of Japanese horror like The Ring, The Eye, and The Happiness of the Katakuris. Now, I don't think the game is directly based on the movie as such. It's more of a horror simulator featuring characters and, I'm guessing, settings that are familiar from the films. So, as the name of the game suggests, it is more of a haunted house simulator. You get 5 levels: an abandoned factory, a hospital, some rundown apartments, a shopping centre, and then a cursed house. Each of the levels plays the same. You take control of a different character, though that doesn't actually make a difference, and when you actually see your character's arms, they do appear to all be the same one, which is kinda lazy. And at the start of each level, something weird happens, and then it gets dark. Of course, all the levels are suitably creepy and dingy. You then walk around the level incredibly slowly, and I really do mean incredibly slowly, armed with just a flashlight, and you've got to find a way to escape wherever it is you are. You'll need to find keys and items to open locked doors and access new areas. As well as this, you have to find batteries for your torch, or flashlight if you want to be all American about it, as the one that you have is shit and the batteries only last a few minutes each. Thankfully, any items you can pick up are always glowing white, so you can see them stand out. Also in each level, you'll find a scrap of paper, and you will need to find one hidden on each level in order to unlock the final stage, which is of course the scariest one. And that's the thing, the game is actually pretty damn scary at times. Your only source of light is of course your torch, and all sorts of creepy things do happen in the levels. There's ghosts everywhere, mostly Ju-On and this strange little kid that makes cat noises, which is actually more funny than scary. They'll follow you around and jump out at you at random places. But on top of this, you've got things like doors slamming, furniture falling on you, and all sorts of other things, which may not sound scary, but the low light, creepy sound effects, and ambient music really do make this effective when you're playing in the dark on your own, like I was. And I did actually have to put on a podcast to help with the spookiness, because I got a bit creeped out. And if you must know, it was the Secret Levels podcast, which if you haven't listened to, I highly recommend. Shout out to Toby and Goobs, who are the hosts of that podcast, and I know they love a bit of horror. Oh, and make sure you check out the Nocturnals Mystery podcast, especially as it's Halloween, from the one and only Jenny Bean, if you are into your spooky podcasts. And no, they didn't ask me to give them this shout out. Anyway, as the levels go on, they do ramp up in the scares, most of them being jump scares with one of the characters jumping out at you from the dark, which can get a bit predictable, especially as they use the whole hand grabbing you when you open a door quite often. But then they do find other ways to mix up the scares when you aren't expecting them. As mentioned, I think the graphics are actually excellent here. The locations all look pretty good. I'm playing the game here on my Wii U, so it's all HDMI and it looks fantastic with some cool animations. The controls can be a bit of a pain in the ass. You have to just use the Wii remote, pointing it to aim your torch, and then you hold the B button to move forward with some of the loudest footsteps ever. You press A to interact with things that you can interact with, and an icon comes up on the screen to let you know when you can do this. And you can also press down on the D-pad to walk backwards, and that's all your controls. There's also times where ghosts will grab you. When this happens, you'll need to waggle the Wii remote in the direction of the arrows shown on screen. Most of the time this worked fine, but I did find there was times where it didn't register my movement and I'd die. These are the only times in the game where you actually can die, and if you do, you have to replay the whole level over again, which is a pain. But it's fine, as it's the Wii, and it can be a bit twitchy at times, and I would have to waggle the Wii remote around sometimes just to get my movements to register, and turning corners in particular was a bit of a pain. This is a short game, with each level taking less than 30 minutes, and you can beat the entire thing in about 2 hours, which is a bit of a shame. But overall, this is actually a really cool atmospheric game. There's easily the scariest one I've played on the Wii, and I would actually recommend giving this a playthrough. Make sure you play it in the dark, and it's even a good one to play with some friends, hunting in the dark for the hidden pages and avoiding getting grabbed by the ghoulies. A Nightmare on Elm Street for the NES is another game that seems to get a lot of crap, but when you play, it's actually not that bad at all. The game takes inspiration from a few of the movies, which, if you aren't aware, are about the evil Freddy Krueger, an old school caretaker who was burned alive for fiddling with kiddies, which is fair enough. But to get his revenge, he somehow gets the power to enter your dreams, and is armed with a glove with knives for fingers, an awesome stripy jumper, and his creepy burnt face. While he's in your dreams, he will terrify you with creepy images or by chasing you or making other monsters appear, and the more scared you are, the more powerful he gets. Then, if he kills you in your sleep, you die in real life. Of course, this all takes place on a place called Elm Street, and the game sees you and amazingly up to 3 friends for a 4-player co-op experience, taking to the streets of Elm Street, where your goal is to enter the buildings there and find Freddy's bones that have been scattered throughout the levels. Once you've collected all the bones, Freddy will appear in a number of different forms for you to fight. Once you've collected all the bones from all the levels and beat his ass a few times, the nightmare is over. The levels have 2 forms, one where you're awake and another when you're asleep. No matter what your state though, they are packed to the brim with enemies, meaning that this town is a fucking nightmare even if you're not asleep. There's huge bats that drop rocks on your heads, snakes, zombies and all sorts of other enemies that you'll fight, and that's even before you fall asleep and go into the dream world. When you do fall asleep, which just sort of happens after a little while, the monsters change into more gruesome things like skeletons or evil Freddy Krueger bats that will take a few more hits as well. When you fall asleep, you'll need to find a boombox which will wake you up. The actual layout of the levels doesn't change, which is good, and you can actually still collect the bones no matter if you're asleep or awake. The bones are littered everywhere, and you'll need to do some hunting for some of them, as they're cunningly hidden so they blend in with the background, or sometimes behind a pillar or something like that, but the levels are never too long. Your main attack is a punch, which is alright. It has a good enough range and the hit detection is decent enough, but the boss fights can be tricky with it. But you can also get a few other powers, which is a nod to the Dream Warriors movie, where the kids Freddy is terrorizing learn to control their dreams and give themselves powers while they're asleep. You'll find tokens in the levels that will change you between a few forms by pressing select. These come in really handy, and I'll be honest, I didn't realise they were a thing until much too late in the game, but it does really help out with some much better attacks. The graphics here are pretty good, to be fair. It does, I guess, look like a standard NES game, but everything is clear and the boss designs are pretty cool. The controls are responsive, you move at a good pace and you have a decent jump, though it can be a bit slippery. But yeah, I would actually say that this is quite a good game. It can seem a little confusing at first, as it seems to be random as to what buildings you can enter and when, but playing this with a friend is really good fun, and actually one that I find myself coming back to quite regularly. I haven't managed to beat it yet, but I do actually plan on doing that soon. Saw, the game from Konami, is set after the first movie. You play as Detective Tapp, who the evil Jigsaw has saved from a gunshot wound, but in return has had him wake up in one of his diabolical death traps. You see, Tapp has been obsessed with Jigsaw and hunting him down, so Jigsaw is being a good Samaritan and teaching him a lesson about the dangers of obsession. He's a nice guy, really. The game is a survival horror title, and you'll be exploring a huge, disgusting old hospital that's filled with other people in the same situation as you, where Jigsaw has pitted everyone against one another and has even hidden puzzle pieces inside other players, so in order to survive, you've got to kill or be killed. Of course, as well as this, there are loads of traps and puzzles for you to solve if you don't want to be torn limb from limb or killed in a large number of ways, most of which are not quick and they're not painless. The game plays like a 3D action game for the most part, with you being able to pick up weapons, mainly things you find laying around, and you'll need to use these to smash people over the head. And the combat is fine, but pretty basic. You've got an attack stance and then a weak or strong attack, nothing out of the ordinary. I will say that there is a bit too much combat here for my liking though, and it really isn't all that necessary, but it's not particularly offensive. It's mainly there to give you something other to do than solve puzzles, but the puzzles are the fun part. Normally what happens is you explore and then you'll find another survivor that isn't a murderous psychopath that is in trouble, and so what you want to do is help them out of their trap so they don't die. This will involve looking around for items, solving simple time-based puzzles, pressing buttons in certain sequences and things like that. None of the things to do are that complex, but they do have a bit of fun to them, and you likely won't help everyone survive on your first playthrough, which I actually found that I did care about when I let people die. Some of the puzzles and traps are actually quite inventive too, and it's quite frustrating when you see the potential for the game. It could have easily been a massive escape room style thing where you have to escape a series of trapped rooms that just get harder and harder. And while that is almost the case here, it does just feel like it's a bit too linear and trying to appeal to people that want to hit people over the head as well as solve puzzles. But surely people playing the game are in it for the grim traps mainly. Though having said that, I really wouldn't say it's a bad game. In fact, I found it hard to put down. Progression here is pretty good, and you've got a decent map to help you out, and I always wanted to see what was coming up next. The graphics are decent enough, and everything is suitably macabre. There are little touches, like the fact that you have no shoes, so have to be careful where you walk, which is very fitting to the game, and you'll leave bloody footprints behind if you walk over broken glass, which is nice. There's a few jump scares thrown in for good measure, as it's a horror game, and really the atmosphere in the game is actually pretty good. And overall, the game itself is actually quite fun. Certainly if you're a fan of the movies. I mean, it's really just an average game that isn't going to blow you away, but for a horror movie tie-in, it's really not bad and will definitely keep you entertained. There is a sequel to this one as well, and I have actually completed both of these games, but I literally cannot remember a single thing about the second game, which can't be a good thing. If I remember rightly though, it's meant to be shit, so if you do need a Saw game, then stick to this one, as it's actually alright. Did you know that the awesome Japanese horror film The Ring got a video game for the Dreamcast? Well, if you didn't, there's probably a reason for that. The Ring movies are all about a cursed videotape that gives anyone who watches it 7 days to live. After those 7 days, those that have watched it die a gruesome death. Well, the game, The Ring Terror's Realm, takes that concept and does a sort of what if with it, with the videotape being replaced by a computer program. The whole thing doesn't really make sense, not that the actual movies themselves make sense either though. You play as Meg, who is investigating the death of her boyfriend, who was found after tampering with the Ring program on his computer. For some reason, she immediately gets his job at the company that he worked for, no questions asked, and starts poking around to try and uncover the truth. It's a survival horror game where you go between a few locations, mainly the office building that you work in, where you'll be talking to a number of suspicious characters who clearly know more than they're letting on. In these parts of the game, you need to explore every inch of every room to look for clues to see what might have happened to your dead boyfriend. The people you meet do their best to hide things from you, but if you find enough evidence and items, then you will get a bit more information out of them. Then there's the Terror's Realm, which is a virtual world you wake up in every time you log into the Ring program on the computer that you really shouldn't be playing with. In this world, you are still Meg, but for some reason you're now part of an elite force that is trying to kill all the monsters and get out of the program alive. This is sort of like a shitty Matrix situation, so if you die in the game, you die in real life. As in the game within the game, not just by playing this game, although. Anyway, in these parts, it plays more like Resident Evil, where you get mostly fixed camera angles, though everything is in 3D, so it does move around a little bit, but you've got no control. You get a few weapons, and there's loads of enemy monsters that are strange ape-like demon things, and as far as I know, nothing to do with the Ring. You can shoot these with your guns, and to be fair, you get a decent amount of ammo and health pickups, which is nice, but you still need to be careful not to waste shots. Sometimes you're better off doing a runner. You can also go into a first person view and have a look around, which is handy when looking for items to collect, but these sections are just kind of bland. They're never really explaining where you are or what you need to do, but you'll soon realise that there's a strange dilapidated version of the office that you've been exploring anyway. As you find more clues to get further into the game, things do get stranger and more deadly enemies will appear, but none of it ever really feels like it's anything to do with the ring, and it could be one of those games that just had the license slapped on at the last minute. Actually playing the game is a bit of a chore. Your character walks incredibly slowly and the limited locations mean that you're doing a ton of backtracking, and it's just so much more noticeable than in games like Resident Evil, where you spend most of your time in one house, but somehow here you really notice that you're just going back and forth between the same 10 rooms over and over. Usually because it's just to trigger a cutscene or find a character, and it's not because there's some big complicated puzzle. It's just a case of go into every room, talk to every character, and then go back through every room until the game lets you go forward. It is pretty tedious, especially as your character moves so damn slowly, especially when walking. Now, the graphics here aren't too bad. I have a special love for pretty much every Dreamcast game's graphics. I just love how they look for some reason, and I might be biased, but it's not an ugly game, I don't think. The voice acting is awesome, and by awesome I mean terrible, but in a good way. There isn't much, most of it is just text, but the way they all talk is just terrible, and the intro cutscene in particular is a real treat. The thing is with this game is that I'm really aware that it's not good, and I didn't even really have very much fun while I was playing it, especially with the awful music loop that grates on you after about 20 seconds, but I did find that I wanted to keep coming back to play it. I don't think I'd recommend it, especially paying money for it, but if you are a fan of cheesy horror and you can deal with quite a bit of jank, then this one might be something you get a bit of enjoyment out of. Like I did, but I didn't, but I kinda did. I really don't know. Here is Van Helsing for the original Xbox, also released on the PS2. This is an action-adventure game where you are Mr. Helsing, a monster hunter who is tracking down all sorts of nasties, in particular that bloody Dracula, who just can't seem to keep himself out of trouble. Along the way you'll meet a ton of other recognisable monsters like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, a werewolf, a hunchback, and not to mention the swarms of skeletons, demons, evil bats and birds and other vampires. Basically everyone and everything you see wants to kill you. Thankfully, you're Hugh Jackman, so you're pretty good at kicking ass and taking names. The levels see you exploring some quite large locations, all with a fixed camera. Here you'll be heading through towns, sewers, graveyards, mountaintops and more on your way to Dracula's castle, and you'll meet a few friendly people on the way and even some ghosts that will need rescuing. Now, the game is pretty much 100% action focused, with enemies spawning in all the time for you to deal with, so it's handy then that the combat here is actually quite good. You have some cool wrist blade things that are your main weapon, and these do some decent damage, and there's loads of combos you can do for some massive damage. As well as these, you'll also find a load of projectile weapons along the way, from pistols and shotguns to crossbows. These are often more powerful and of course can attack from a range, but you do have limited ammo. Though, having said that, they're pretty generous with it, and I never found that I ran out at any point. You can swap between the weapons you have at any point, with some being better against certain enemies than others. Often you'll need to kill all the enemies before a magic barrier will vanish and you can crack on with getting to the castle. What's cool is that you also have a grappling hook that comes in very handy, as you can use it to grab onto predetermined bits of scenery to get around. But more importantly, you can use it while you're in combat, which is really good fun. You can basically use it against any enemy, you'll shoot it at them and then you can either pull yourself towards them or pull them towards you. This is really handy for getting out of a tight spot, and it also opens up some really cool combos for you to do. And it's also really handy against any flying bastards. And speaking of combos, when you kill enemies, they'll drop green orb things. These are basically currency, and you can also find them by smashing just about anything on the scenery. Collecting these lets you upgrade your abilities in between levels. You can increase your health, special moves, weapon power, and even buy new combos. You can also use them to buy things between levels, like health packs that you can use at any point in the inventory menu. This is a nice touch. You'll also find loads of hidden rooms. These often have items that increase your health bar or give you more strength for a bit, which is nice. Most of the time you need a certain weapon to destroy a wall or something like that, so you have to do multiple playthroughs to see everything, as you won't always have the weapons you need. As well as this, you can find literal Easter eggs. You place these on certain spots in the map to unlock cheats and bonuses like new costumes and extra powers, and some will take you to bonus levels. Graphically, I actually kind of like how it looks. I'm playing it here on the Xbox 360 as it is backwards compatible, and it looks crisp and clean with loads of detail, and the animations are great. The likeness of Hugh Jackman is excellent, and he even voices his character for the game, which is always a good thing. Overall, I actually quite like this game. It's pretty much your bang average movie tie-in game, but it's completely inoffensive and actually has some cool moments in it. It's quite hard at times with the amount of enemies coming at you, and a lot of people will probably compare it to a poor man's Devil May Cry. But the fact that you can buy it for so cheap and it worked on the Xbox 360 for me makes it one that's worth checking out. I had a lot of fun with it. And finally for today, here is Land of the Dead: The Road to Fiddler's Green for PC, also released on the original Xbox. This is a prequel to the Land of the Dead movie, which is actually a pretty cool zombie movie from the master George A. Romero. It takes place at the start of the outbreak and you play as a farmer called Jack, which is very exciting. You start out at Jack's farm where everything starts going to shit, so you start caving in some skulls before discovering that there's a safe haven at the other side of the city. So you make your way to safety through the farms, into the city, underground in the sewers, back into another city, until you find it. As some of the more eagle-eyed viewers may have noticed, this is a first-person shooter, and you get a good mixture of guns and melee weapons to use. You've got pistols and rifles and shotguns for the most part, but you'll also find things like Molotov cocktails. For the melee attacks, you have your fists, but they're basically useless. You'll also find a hammer, a spade, a baseball bat, and things like that. Strangely, you can carry as many guns as you like, and all the ammo that they need, but you can only carry one melee weapon at a time, so make sure you figure out which one is your favourite. I quite like the baseball bat or the golf club personally. What's cool is that the melee weapons all have two attacks, a standard swing which each have different range and powers depending on what it is, and then there's a secondary attack which you do with the right mouse button, which takes a lot longer to swing but will knock down zombies, letting you have a bit of a breather. Certain weapons like the fire axe can also be used to dismember zombies, letting you cut off their arms and legs so they can't chase you, or if you want to go crazy, just chop off their head. You can also use powerful guns to do this, and shooting off zombies' legs is often a good tactic, so they're slower and they can't swarm you, which they will try to do. It doesn't take long before there's loads of zombies showing up, and it can be easy to get surrounded and even killed. But it can also be easy to outwit the zombies as they're practically brain dead, which I guess is kind of the point of zombies. You can often just position yourself between zombies and an obstacle and they'll just give up trying to kill you, despite the fact they could just walk around it. Or if there's a car nearby, just jump on it there and they won't be able to touch you. And there was even times where enemies would just stand still in one place looking at me while I smashed their head in with a golf bat. There's a few varieties of zombies, but for the most part they just shamble towards you, and then stop for a second or two before attacking. This is your chance to knock them down with a melee weapon or just one-shot them with a decently powered gun. Even with this though, there were times when you can't use cheap tactics and will have to go on the defensive, and there was even times when the game was almost tense. All the levels here are kinda bland though, and other than the odd moment where you see zombies smashing down doors, you never really do anything particularly exciting other than explore quite empty levels looking for ammo and the key that you need to open the door to the exit. Graphically, the game is fine, there's not a lot of detail anywhere, but I do actually quite like how the zombies look. Kinda like with Dreamcast games, I've just got a bit of a love for how games used to look back in these days, and I actually find it quite charming. The animations on the weapons are decent, but the zombies are all pretty dumb looking when they move. They will shamble slowly or sometimes move too fast like they've been sped up. The controls work fine and I actually never had any issues there. I don't think the shooting is particularly perfect, but it's not too bad. So yeah, this isn't a particularly great FPS game, but as I do tend to with crappy games, I did have a bit of fun. And the fact that it's actually now an abandonware game and the PC version can be found very easy for free with a quick Google search means that it is one that I would actually say is worth checking out if you're playing on PC. It's definitely worth a go for free. As long as you can set your expectations quite low, you might have a bit of a laugh. So there you go, a bunch of video games based on horror movies. There are of course a lot more out there, so make sure you let me know some of your favourites in the comments below. Horror movies and games are some of my favourites, so I'll definitely try out as many as I can. But now, all that's left for me to say is thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.